Yeah, I did write a self-criticism. I remember talking about it to John Pomfret, and he said, just imagine that the self-criticism could be printed on the front page of People's Daily. So The Souls of China was a book that, it has its flaws, and like any nonfiction book, it begins to date after time because you're writing about events in the past, inevitably, right? But I think it does capture an overall trend in China that was valid and is still valid.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to a new episode of Peking Hotel. I'm your host, Leo. Today, you're in for a treat because our good friend, the Pulitzer-winning veteran journalist Ian Johnson, is going to review in one episode his journey of writing 3 major books on religion and the spiritual life in China. Ian is a Pulitzer-winning writer and researcher based in Berlin. He's also the founder and director of China Unofficial Archives, a repository for hundreds of books, magazines, and underground films banned in China. His latest book, Sparks, China's Underground, its historians and their battle for the future, shows how, despite the best efforts of Xi Jinping's surveillance state, a nationwide movement has coalesced to challenge the Communist Party on its hallowed ground, the control of history. Ian lived in China for more than 20 years and has been following the country since first going there as a student in Beijing from 1984 to 85. And after being expelled from China in 2020, he became a senior fellow at Council on Foreign Relations and now enrolled as a PhD student at the University of Leipzig. We have previously run 2 episodes with Ian, and today we do a grand sweep of his book writing journey and unfold with you China's spiritual quest from the 90s to Xi Jinping's era, with sprinkles of top writing tips along the way for aspiring writers. And I hope you enjoy it. Last time we spoke about your Pulitzer-winning Falun Gong reporting. How did that and other experiences change your views on China throughout the 90s?
I think the crackdown on Falun Gong made me realize that the party was still willing to use pretty strong violence to crush a movement. That was quite clear from Falun Gong, and I think that informed how I ended up writing my book on the 1990s, essentially, which is Wild Grass. Because in that case, that book, all 3 storylines, the people failed. I remember somebody asking me, my editor I mentioned before, Marcus Broccoli, the China editor at the Wall Street Journal, he's like more of an optimistic guy. He says, all your people failed. Couldn't there have been like one of the people that succeeded? I said, yeah, I don't know. This is my experience, this is what the reporting led me to. And the book is not meant to be negative, right? But
it doesn't read negative either, even despite the fact that they all failed.
Yeah, well, I can't remember what the last line of the book is something like, I'm still hopeful, we're still waiting, or something. I believe that's what Mrs. Zhang said at the end of the book.
About the party, actually, I think.
Or about, yeah, I don't know if it was about China in general, or just, so even though she had all these setbacks. I mean, you could see in some ways that these people, even though they failed, in a broader sense, they did affect policy. I don't know directly, but I can't say this movement caused that policy thing, but the farmers who sued, so we're saying Wild Grass has three stories. One is about farmers who sue the government to stop illegal taxation. Another is about urban dwellers who try to sue the government to stop tearing down of old Beijing. And another is about the Falun Gong story, which is about also trying to petition and redress a wrong. In the case of the farmers, the government really did change policy, and they eliminated all those taxes that the farmers had argued against, those illegal taxes. Remember, there were dozens of little taxes to do this, tax to do that, tax to sell goods on the market. They got rid of all those taxes for farmers. And in terms of the urban protection, of course, Chinese cities still ended up tearing down most of their old cities, but the urban preservation movement did take hold. I mean, certainly under Xi Jinping, the destruction of old Beijing is completely stopped. That's like the one thing. You find people in Beijing now who will say, oh, I hate Xi Jinping, but he stopped the destruction of old Beijing because he likes Beijing. So maybe in that sense they succeeded, I'm not sure. In the case of Falun Gong, although it was brutally suppressed, and Falun Gong would not agree with this, but the government ended up changing its policy toward these folk religious groups and supporting them with intangible cultural heritage. So they call them now intangible cultural, and not Falun Gong, of course, because that's like a totally taboo thing. They challenge the government, so it has to be destroyed. So you could say perhaps that some of these movements did succeed in making, even though the cost was terribly high.
After this stint in China, you became the Wall Street Journal's Berlin bureau chief. And following 9/11, you reported on Islamic extremism in Germany. Why did you move to Germany?
I'd been in China for 7 years, and I wanted to leave after a while. I felt like I wanted to come back to China, but I wanted to get away for a little while. And I'd lived in Germany before, and I wanted to go back there. It was exciting to be there for 9/11 because 9/11, there were, for people who don't know, there were 4 airplanes that were piloted, and 3 of them crashed into buildings. 2 in the World Trade Center, 1 in the Pentagon, and 1 was crashed into a field, probably because the passengers overwhelmed the hijackers. But 3 of those 4 pilots were radicalized in Germany. So we were at the center. This came out very quickly. Like, they realized that 3 of the 4 pilots had just come from Germany. And the second day, they knew that. And I was in charge of all that terrorism coverage. And I was in on endless meetings about terrorism coverage. And that was really a good side of journalism, because there was like a news story, and you were actually finding stuff out and breaking it. And I had reporters out in the field, reporters in Hamburg, where 2 of the pilots had been living and reporting on these various things. So it was exciting and it was meaningful, and I ended up writing a book about that, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And right after that was 9/11. And for a while I had 9 people that I was managing. And it was, if I wanted to just make a career in journalism, that was a good job. And I could have continued on. I could have stayed bureau chief there for a decade and gone to maybe another place or something like that. But I think I realized after a while that this is not what I wanted to do. I had just written, in fact, when I got to Berlin, I guess it was in April or May, I remember writing Wild Grass. Before we bought this place, I was staying with a friend in her apartment, and I remember sitting on the sofa writing Wild Grass there. And the process of that was really satisfying, and I really liked it. And I knew, and also I mentioned that I was friends with Peter Hessler, and I really I was on this like crash course of writing, nonfiction writing, and reading John McPhee and all these classics, and I thought, gosh, this is really what I want to do. I want to write books, I want to write magazine-style articles, but I just accepted this big promotion to be the Germany bureau chief. And so I did that, but I wanted to get out of it pretty quickly.
And when did you eventually return to China?
The Neiman was 06, 07. And in 07, I was still with the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal applied for me to get a visa to go back to China. And the foreign ministry rejected it very emphatically and said, this person will never get back to China because what he wrote about Falun Gong. And the foreign editor who was involved in the talk, who was in Beijing at some point, this is John Bussey, the same guy who had been my editor for Falun Gong, he said, is it possible for him to come in and maybe cover something. And they kind of said something like, well, it's possible to consider a J2 visa. So J1 visa is a resident visa. This is the one you want. It's a 12-month multiple entry visa that is renewable. The J2 visa is you come in on a limited time. You say, I'm coming in to cover such and such an event, and then you get a 30-day visa, and then you leave. And so they said yes, and so this began this dance, which took quite a lot of effort on our part and other people, and everyone sort of said, you have to make it possible for reformers in the system to argue your case. So you're going to have to give them some cover, and that would involve confidence building. So maybe getting in on these short-term visas and then not tackling anything too sensitive, writing something like a self-criticism, and then at the right moment.
Did you actually do that, writing the self-criticism?
Well, I'll tell you, yeah. And then at the right moment, so the strategy was then at the right moment, you have somebody come in and try to, a high-level figure come in and speak on your behalf. And then they do it as a favor to that person. But you've already kind of set it up ahead of time. I think sometimes people think that if you just have a door opener figure like Henry Kissinger speak on your behalf, then that's how you do it. That they have magic. But actually, those people are useful when the door is already cracked open and they can just kind of push it open. So yeah, so what we did is I got J2 visas. I remember I got the first one, it was the Davos in China, and they had it at Dalian.
The summer of Davos.
That was the summer of Davos, yeah. I guess that was 2007. And I got a 3-day visa. And so I had to fly in, go up to Davos, report on a couple of things, inconsequential, and then fly back. And I wrote an article, or two, but I think just one article, and it was just basically on Davos. So it was kind of innocuous Wall Street Journal sort of thing. And then I got a 5-day visa, and then I got a 10-day visa, and then I got a 2-week visa. And by then we're already into 2008, and it's the summer. This is, of course, why the context is important. It's the Olympics coming up, and China doesn't want to look like they're keeping foreign reporters out. They gave me a 3-week, almost a 4-week visa to cover the Summer Olympics. And meanwhile, to answer your question, yeah, I did write a self-criticism. I remember talking about it to John Pomfret, and he said, just imagine that the self-criticism could be printed on the front page of People's Daily. So you don't want to say anything that you're going to regret. You don't want to, and in fact, don't regret anything you did. Don't say, oh, I apologize for this, that, I wish I hadn't done this or that. So I wrote this long 10-page thing on my why I got interested in China, and back in college, the whole thing, going to Beijing and
like a personal biography.
Yeah, it was a personal biography, and then I got up to Falun Gong, and I said, of course, now in hindsight, being more mature now, I would do things a lot differently. Of course, maybe I was thinking, I would like really stick the dagger in even further. But you could also read that to mean, oh, well, I wouldn't, believe those guys. I didn't say anything more about Falun Gong or anything. I didn't even directly mention that in terms of Falun Gong. But that was kind of what they needed. It was like, I thought of it like the quote that if somebody were to say, well, look, he said he'd do things differently now. And so I remember talking a month or two later to some guy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who kind of laughed at me or said sardonically, oh, I read your self-criticism. It was so touching. I didn't know you loved China so much. Kind of like, yeah, good job with the bullshit. And then the door opener, let's say, was none other than Rupert Murdoch, who I had written an op-ed against in 2007. And he had a government relations person called Yen Mei. Yen Mei she was like a Gauganzadi. She was sort of like a minor level princeling. Her father had been in charge of like the radio and television, maybe not the whole ministry, but like a deputy or something like that. But still, in the context of 1950s and 60s China, it was fairly important, I guess. And she was working for Dow Jones as their government relations person. She was maybe 10 years older than me, so she would have been, in her 50s or 60 around that time. And then she told Murdoch, Murdoch didn't know me from any Adam, she told him, okay, we're going to go meet. I can't remember exactly who it was he was going to go meet. We've got a case for journalists who can't get a visa. Here's what you need to say. And so then Murdoch, took his notes and went into the meeting and then just said, oh, this guy, give him a chance, blah, blah, blah. Do it as a favor for Rupert Murdoch. And they did. That's exactly the way they can sell it then. Okay, as a favor for the Lao Tozi, for old Murdoch, who's been playing ball with us and avoiding sensitive things. Let's do that, because of course Murdoch wanted to just make money, right? This is still when people thought they could make money in media in China. And so then at the end of '08, I got the news. I got a full J1 visa starting January 1st, '09. And I have to say, I knew that I did not want to stay at the Wall Street Journal. It wasn't just because of Murdoch, but the paper was changing. It was becoming less investigative, less featurey. And it was becoming more conventional. And also I was changing. I wanted to write magazine pieces. I wanted to write these books. I wanted to write my book on China.
But you still wrote a lot for New York Times.
Yeah, initially I did write a lot.
It's almost like weekly, if not like...
So for the last few years that I was with the Times in China, I did very little for them. And although it financially was a bit of a risk, it worked out okay, because I could completely devote myself to my books and working for the New York Review of Books. And that's probably was the most fruitful relationship I had all through the 2010s, was with the New York Review of Books. Every year, even up to today, since then, for the past 15 years, I write about 3 full-length articles a year for them. Sometimes more, almost never less, sometimes less. So I've written over 45, 50 full-length features for them. And then also, starting in 2010, that important year, I started this Q&A series with public intellectuals in China, which I call Talking About China. It still has a dedicated page on the New York Review of Books website. And there I talked to about 30 public intellectuals. And my wife, Chi-In, wasn't my wife at the time, but she was a photographer. She took a lot of the portraits of the people, so that it's quite attractive photographically. And that was also important as a nice body of work, and just in general for helping to shape my thinking through the 2010s. And I was doing this Q&A series, and I was talking to some people about the spiritual dimension. What also came up was the historical dimension, history as a kind of religion, history as a faith. And so I knew early on in the 2010s that I also wanted to write a book on the uses of history in China. There's a really good book by Jane Kramer. She was a New Yorker correspondent in Europe for decades. And it was called The Uses of History. And it was all about German history and how it's... anyways, that kind of inspired me a little bit. But the religion book took shape quite early. And I knew I wanted to write on different faith groups. My first decision was to only write about Han Chinese, because it would be infeasible to write about all the different ethnic groups in China and their faiths. It would become like an encyclopedia. And I also thought that if you start talking about the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, these are really different topics. These are really different subjects. It's all often about ethnicity, independence maybe, struggle against Han chauvinism, Han domination. Those are different topics. Another reason is that I don't speak those languages, so I can't interview the people the way I'd want to interview them. So it would make it hard to do that, or impossible. China is basically a multi-ethnic empire, and if you think of it in terms of colonial studies, you have the colonies and you have the metropole. The metropole is basically China proper, what people used to call China proper, which is something the CCP hates. But this is basically China from, roughly speaking, Beijing in the north to somewhere in the south, maybe Yunnan or Guangzhou or something.
And the CCP also has a term, they call it Zhongyuan, right? The Zhongyuan captures that.
Central Plains?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zhongyuan is probably a bit smaller than China proper. But
yeah.
Yeah.
And then, from the coast, say Shanghai nowadays, to the Sichuan Basin. And this is where...
Well, anywhere that's not Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia.
Dongbei.
Or Manchuria.
Yeah, so that I thought that if I focused on the Han, then I would still be covering 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. It's already enormous. Anyway, then the Souls of China.
And for the book, one thing I really wanted to ask is how the book evolved. I mean, what did you want to achieve with the book when you began? And
well, I wanted to show that there was this spiritual/religious revival in China. That was the overall thing. I think also I really believed that religion was undercovered in China. And just like Gosar and Palmer talked about in history, I think also just in general, that there was this whole revival going on. And so, I think overall it worked out pretty well.
And when did you have the idea of writing the book?
I came back to China with the goal of writing the book. That was my goal for going back. I wanted to go back even in the 90s, I wanted to write a book on religion in China and Taoism. And then that kind of became the Falun Gong part of Wild Grass. But then I thought, no, I want to do a proper book just on religion in China, maybe on Taoism. I used to toy with the idea of writing a guidebook to Taoist China.
The Souls of China has 5 different storylines. How did you pick your main protagonists of the book?
I knew I had to choose one Christian group. I traveled around a lot. I didn't just hit on Wang Yi and Chengdu. Actually, I didn't know of Wang Yi initially. Somebody else introduced him to me. I went to Henan because this is a center of Christianity, of Protestantism. Well, first I had the decision to make Catholicism versus Protestantism. I ruled out Catholicism because Catholicism, it's got this amazingly colorful story, the Jesuits and Matteo Ricci and all these people. It's got a great history, but it had been largely stagnant, and it had not changed at all since 1949. It just tracked population growth. So there used to be 3 million Catholics, and then there were roughly 10 million Catholics, 12 million. So I decided to rule out the Catholics. The Protestants seemed much more interesting and dynamic. And then I wanted to go to an urban church, because China was urbanizing, and that's where the interesting stories were. And so I picked then the Wang Yi's church in Chengdu. Wang Yi, somebody introduced me to him. He's a very well-known person. Probably of all the people I wrote about in The Souls of China, I had the most qualms about him because I wanted everybody to be representative. I wanted them to be not outliers. And okay, the Li family went to Carnegie Hall, but overall it was completely irrelevant to their lives. It's like this weird thing because they met this ethnographer. But they were pretty ordinary people, and there's lots of people like them. There are other musical troops all around Shanxi province that do all this stuff. But Wang Yi was maybe profiling Billy Graham. I don't know if people know Billy Graham anymore, but he was one of the most important, famous post-war pastors in the United States was like a rock star. Billy Graham crusade, and he had stadiums full of people. Obviously, Wang Yi did not have stadiums full of people; it'd be impossible. But he was a well-known public intellectual, a human rights lawyer, and he was not a typical Protestant pastor in China. He was a charismatic figure, and he was a great speaker.
Sounds more like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela.
A bit more, maybe like that. So he was a bit of an outlier, but the overall trend of these big urban churches that were their own ecosystem was a valid macro trend. And also, he was a good speaker. And at some point, it was this guy's just a compelling figure, and that's where maybe the journalist in me overrode the ethnographer in me, which was it must be perfectly representative, Okay, he's not perfectly representative. He was already challenging the government. He'd already been in trouble with the government, challenging the government. Most pastors don't challenge the government. And so in some ways, I was playing into the stereotype of the, brave fighting against the government type pastor or religious figure. But
which you did not want to report on, but you got pulled into his circle, his charisma, I suppose.
Yeah, and just also that there was so much going on in this church that was so interesting. and which was reflected nationally in these other churches, that I was like, okay, we'll go with him.
And how did you pick up your contacts, your main protagonists of the book?
Well, there were, of course, there are several different ones. The Taoist musicians, the Li family in Yanggaoxian in Shanxi near Datong, they were, ironically, I was in New York City. What was I there for? I can't remember exactly, but maybe like in 2009 or something like that, or 2010 for something or another. And they had a concert at Carnegie Hall of sacred music. And there was this very eccentric Englishman, Stephen Jones. I shouldn't say he is a bit eccentric, but he's also maybe one of the foremost ethnomusicologists in China. He's written a series of books about music in northern China. And he was also like the manager of the Li family. He had written a little bit about them in the past and had brought them before to Holland and once before to England, and he brought them now to participate in this concert at Carnegie Hall. I went there, and I passed my name card in the back, and I said, can I meet anybody? I thought the Li family was the most interesting of the people up on stage. And I went back and talked to them, and I met Li Bin, the son, and he said, oh yeah, if you're ever in China again, come on by. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool. It's not, I'm thinking I don't see the spiritual thing. They had Taoist stuff on, but I didn't really, they weren't ordained Taoist priests, right? And this is, of course, again, a misunderstanding that people have, that you've got to be part of the Daojiao Xiehui, the Taoist Association of China, in order to be a real Taoist. But these people were Zhengyi Pai. This is a very established part of Taoism, but this is a patrilineal descent group. So you inherit your Taoist position from your father. Of course, you might end up not wanting to do it or something, but they were usually father and son down through the generations. And I went to Datong, and I'm trying to remember exactly why I went to Datong, but I had their name card, being pretty obsessively organized, and so I called up Li Bin. I said, oh, I'm in Datong. He said, oh, come on and see us. We're working. We got a concert this afternoon. I'm like, you do? Like, wow, that's cool. So I immediately got in a cab, and I drove out from Datong to Yanggaoxian, which is like an hour and a half drive. We got out there, and they're in like somebody's home, their courtyard home, and there's like a casket at the dead body, right? And it's like, what are you guys doing? And it looks, because people are dressed in white. I said, I know enough about China. This is a funeral, right? He says, yeah. We're at a funeral. I'm like, okay, well, wait a minute. I thought you guys were Carnegie Hall musicians. And he says, oh, that's like this weird thing that Steve has us do every like 5 years. We get to go overseas on some thing and learn. But the rest of the time, we're doing this. And so that's how I got to meet them. And then I realized, oh, their real job is, they are Taoist. They do funerals. They do other things besides funerals, but 80% of what they do is like funerals. The Miaofeng Shan, I had gone to Miaofeng Shan in the 1990s and was fascinated by the mountain and by its history. And I went back there when I was looking for things to write on. I was just curious, so I went to the Temple Fair in 2010 or 2011. 2011. It was 2011, and then I went to Temple Fair kind of at the end. I didn't quite understand. Oh, Temple Fair is only really like the most interesting at the beginning, even the night before, and all this stuff. And I got there near the end when they were closing up, and I met the old Mr. Ni, who later passed away during the next year, and he said, "Come and talk to me." And so over that summer, then in 2011, I went to their home and got to know the Ni family, and I thought, okay, that's it. This is the real deal, and this is perfect. The government thing was also trying to show the rituals of CCP rule, and maybe in that sense influenced a little bit by Robert Bella and the idea of civil religion. They have these like religious rituals, and just like in the United States with these things of all these like holidays and different things, patriotism and so on, but to show the Chinese version of that in how the Liang Hui takes place and the symbolism, the religious, spiritual symbolism of the Great Hall of the People, the stars and all of the number of columns would imitate the number of columns in the Forbidden City and the architecture of it, which has been brilliantly described by Wu Heng, the University of Chicago art professor. So to show the government as living rituals also, its own CCP kind of spiritual life. The internal alchemy chapters, these are the ones, the chapters all have like titles. So there's the Chengdu chapters are all called Chengdu, and then it'll have a subtitle. And that way it was a structure for readers to be able to figure out what was, because these are 5 parts and be confusing. So that would make it easier. This is Chengdu, this is Beijing, and there's some called practice, and that was the Nei Dan, the internal alchemy. I mentioned, I think before I was introduced to him through this guy, Nanhuai Jin, who I wrote about a bit.
What was the reporting process for Souls of China?
I wanted to structure it around the calendar, so I structured it around 1 lunar year, with the Jieqi being little mini seasons through the year. And I did all the reporting, even though I started it earlier and I would go back and report on it later, but I did all the reporting in that 1 year, which was 2012. So in 2012, because purposefully I wanted to be able to show the direct parallels in these faith groups. And I think the most striking to me in doing that, the most interesting parallel was going directly from 3 things. I went to Babaoshan for a government story, which is how Qingming was difficult for Tiananmen victims. So the Tiananmen mother who tries to lay wreaths at her husband and son's tomb every year. And I mean, to me, that's like one of the best, I think it was one of the best little short story things that I've written, because it was kind of, I'd met her before and in her home, and she told me all about her life, but then she went to try to pay respects at the Qingming festival, and they never let her go on Qingming. They always make her go a week or 2 ahead of time. So it actually worked out for me perfectly, because then for Qingming I could go to Shanxi, but so I go there, I see her trying to lay the flowers down, and the Guobao person going with her, escorting her around, and then spent the Qingming with the Li family. And that allowed me to understand their whole family history, and they were doing funerals and stuff like that. And then I went from there directly to Chengdu for Easter, because it's how these things have this perfect synchronicity sometimes, these religions. There's clearly something about death and rebirth in the springtime, right? And this is like, I say kind of universal. At least you have it in traditional Chinese culture, you got it in Christian culture. And so it made these neat parallelisms in the book. But it only really worked because it was happening in real time. And that gave the book, I think, a bit of dynamism. So it wasn't me patching together these things. It was actually really happening at that time. It was a crazy year. So The Souls of China was a book that, it has its flaws, and like any nonfiction book, it begins to date after time, because you're writing about events in the past, inevitably, right? So, but I think it does capture an overall trend in China that was valid and is still valid. This search for meaning, and some people find it in spiritualism or religion or something like that.
How long did it take for you to write Souls of China, actually?
Oh, like a year. I had a writing schedule where I would wake up every morning and I would make myself tea, and then I would go and, ideally, this probably didn't happen all the time, but ideally I wouldn't even look at my email. I would look at email, I would often turn off the router in the computer, in the room, and I would go to a sofa that was in the corner, And there's actually like this enormous glass table, so it's just like hard to like climb over to get onto the sofa. And I would sit there with my laptop and I would write. And I wouldn't let myself take a break until I had written 500. Well, I'd go take a pee or whatever. But I would have to have my 500 to 1,000 words down. Now, yeah, there's going to be some people who write best when they're drinking whiskey at midnight or something like that, but probably most of us don't do that. What most people say, and this is certainly my experience, is the best thing is to do it when you're fresh. For me, I'm a morning person. I think probably most people, their mind is fresher in the morning. Don't waste your time on email and all that shit. You can, once you get going down the email thing, it's like, oh, I just sat down and said, oh, I could almost, get rid of those 10 more emails. I just, before you know it, it's like, oh, an hour has gone by. Oh, an hour and a half has gone by. Oh, 2 hours has gone by. And then your brain is starting to get a little bit fried. I now have a second cup of coffee. Now I'm going right. That's like a slippery slope. It's better not to do that. But what I would normally do is, if I'm working on a chapter, I would get up and this isn't like some genius insights or whatever, but I would then read the chapter through to where I am and just start writing. And try to not fixate on, do I have the source? Do I have the quote right? Just say, I know there's a quote by this guy saying blah, blah, blah. Just put in, quote by so-and-so saying blah, blah, blah. Keep writing.
How about your other books? How did you find your publishers?
I had an agent. Named Chris Calhoun. He was good at he knew all the people. He'd worked in New York for a long time, and he was able to pitch Wild Grass to Pantheon, which is part of Random House, and an editor there named Dan Frank. Dan had edited Yu Hua. I can't remember if I said last time, but when I handed in the manuscript for Wild Grass, it was just at the time of 9/11, and they said wait on it, so they published Wild Grass in 2004. Then I came up with the Moscow Munich book. Chris offered it to Dan. Dan got approval. Dan said yes. He got approval from Sonny Maeda, who was his editor. But then the paperback guy said, no, there's another book coming out on Islam in Europe that's coming out from another part of Random House. It's going to come out in paperback at the same time. I can't take this. So he killed it. You have to have like three editors' approval. Then I went with Harcourt, which was an okay experience, but they weren't. The editor I had, here's one of these things to publish. The editor I had at Harcourt who bought it left. So then you're kind of like left with another editor who inherits this book, maybe doesn't really like it, or maybe does like it, but you don't really know. It's not their book. They didn't buy it. It's not their baby. It's kind of like an adopted child. That was okay. And then for The Souls of China, Chris went back to Dan. Then Dan was like, oh, this is going to be great. And he did a good job editing it, a beautiful cover. He came up with the title. And then the funny thing is, this is actually really a good story. One of the blog pieces that I wrote for the review was assigned to me by the editor, this guy, Matt. And Matt said, I've always wanted to know, I've read this stuff. He said, Timothy Snyder, who's a well-known American academic and with the Holocaust and wars and stuff, he wrote a piece for us called Who Killed More, Stalin or Hitler? And he sort of laid it out, right? And said, Matt was like, why don't you do Who Killed More, Maoist, Stalin, Hitler, or Mao? How does Mao, he didn't quite say, well, how does Mao fit into it? Because I've read all these numbers. And so I wrote a blog piece for them on this. Because, it's actually kind of interesting in a morbid way. It's like, how do you describe death? So in the course of writing this piece, I cited Zhang Rong, her piece, her book that she wrote with her husband, Zhong Chang, right? So better known to English writers. And she'd written Wild Swans, and she wrote a book with her husband, Halliday, a biography of Mao. And she sort of said, oh, Mao was responsible for, like 100 million deaths or something like that. And then I said, in the piece, I said, there's this other number given by the well-known author so-and-so, but this is not accepted as serious by any serious academic. And then when we went to pitch the book she was Dan Frank's author. So Dan comes back with the Sparks pitch, and it was like 12 hours, he rejected it. He didn't even think about it. It was just like, he just like
no. And he rejected it with one line, no, I'm not interested. And then he wrote like a whole paragraph saying, fuck you to me, basically saying, how could you say fuck you, those words, but he said, how could you have, impugned the reputation of this woman did excellent archival research in the archive. And the article was like 5 years earlier, right? It wasn't like I just written it. It was fresh in his mind. It was clear he just had it in for me.
How did you get the idea of writing Sparks?
Well, it goes back to this Q&A series I did for the New York Review of Books from 2010 to 2020 called Talking About China, which is, as of today, in 2024, is still on their website. It's a dedicated page which has all the Q&As on there and photos. The very first person I talked to in the series was Yang Jishang, and he of course, it made me realize there was different ways of looking at different ways that people try to solve China's authoritarian malaise. There are some people who look at it as a spiritual quest, like China has to have a spiritual revolution before it can have a political revolution. This is something, there were quite a few people converted to Christianity after June 4th, some very prominent pastors. And I think they all felt like the political revolution failed because they had not done a spiritual revolution, if you see what I mean. But the other people I talked to felt that there's still that history was the cause of the problem, that the party's control of history was something that had to be broken up. So those people I began to talk to over the 2010s, and I began to think this would be a really great topic for a book. And I quickly knew that I would write about this eventually. I thought I'd write The Souls of China first, because I was already in 2012, locked into this roller coaster and write that. But while I was writing it in 2013, 14, 15, basically, I was also going out and doing all the reporting for Sparks. I was starting to do the reporting for Sparks. So I continued to sort of work on this through the 2010s and think of places to go. The book, I think, suffered slightly because I was expelled from China in 2020. I had expected to stay in China for another year. And if the COVID and everything, the Trump administration's suicidal policies on China hadn't intervened, I would have probably stayed. But even in hindsight, the Trump policies didn't really matter because nobody could go back to China because of COVID. But anyways, I plan to go to a couple more places and see a few more things. Like one place I never went to, which is unbelievable. I never went to Lin Zhao's grave.
I gather Ai Xiaoming is one of the main characters of your book. How did you know Ai Xiaoming, and what's your impression of her?
Well, Ai Xiaoming, this was a trip that she and I took to Wuhan in 2018. And we interviewed Hu Fayun, and also who's a novelist, and Ai Xiaoming. And she was already a pretty well-known public intellectual person who had been involved. She knew Wang Xiaobo very well. She knew Liu Xiaobo. She had lived in Beijing at that golden period in the 1980s and had talked to all these people. She'd been the subject of many, many writings, because, especially from a feminist perspective. She was helpful and outgoing. I think she willing to let us come into her home and talk and have her portrait taken. She's also, she's in some ways, I would say in some ways almost intimidating, because she's so smart and she knows so much and she's done so many things that you can't just wing it going into the interview. You can't just kind of like, so what are you up to, or something like that, because she's up to like 20 different things. You've got to be specific about what you want to ask her. And her biography is so interesting and so complicated that it took a lot of time just to go through her whole bio.
Why did you decide to make her the central figure, one of the central figure?
A lot things intersected there. She was involved because of her personal biography. It's important in a book that you have somebody who can go from the beginning to the end of the book. And she and Zhang Shui did that. I was born in 52, I think. Her biography is kind of the biography of the PRC. She was involved in the Cultural Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. She was sent down youth, but she was young, on the young end of it. 2000, she was like really involved in the civil society movement. And that made her an interesting person. And I think that she had such a rich body of documentary film. I wanted somebody who was a filmmaker. And I thought Ai Xiaoming's films covered the gamut of topics, especially current issues. When you sit down with the material that you have, and then you begin to think, okay, I want somebody who I can put in this section, and in every section, I've got to have her. Do I have enough material to do that? I have enough with Ai Xiaoming for sure. So, because I can tell the Jiabian ghost story at the beginning in the Northwest section, and I can have her in subsequent sections. She just, pops up again and again in the book.
And what did you want to achieve with Sparks?
Well, I don't know. It's kind of funny when you're starting a project like this, you don't really know exactly how it's going to turn. I think I had a clearer vision with Souls of China, what I wanted to achieve. I wanted to show there was this spiritual revival going on below the surface in China, et cetera, et cetera. With Sparks, I think it was... I guess I just wanted to describe what was this thing that was going on. It was, for me, intellectually really interesting because of the breadth of this, and it was opening up new horizons for me in understanding China's dissident culture. I didn't realize how much stuff they had done over the decades. I think my attitude toward the intellectuals in the 90s, and I'm going to write on grassroots stuff because the intellectuals aren't doing anything anyways, it was not only stupid but arrogant. And I think I realized working on this book just opened up, wow, like these people have really been doing a lot of stuff. And sure, they haven't affected anything in a way, right? But you can't expecting them to win is a bit much, right? I guess I was also kind of pissed off in a way that people like me had that attitude, and then also the broader public in the West was so familiar of these not the Western, but the Eastern, Central and Eastern European intellectuals like Solzhenitsyn, Kundera, Václav Havel, filmmakers like Milos Forman. They were kind of household names for people in the West in the Cold War, for educated people, not the Lao Baixing in America or something like that, but people who read the New York Review of Books, right? They would know who these people are. I thought, boy, that really needs... Here's a chance to introduce readers to these kinds of people. Many Americans think that nothing's happening in China, that it's been completely eradicated. It's all Xi Jinping all the time. And I think this book shows that there are things still happening in China, and that you can't completely write off the country.
You touched on your being expelled from China. You said it's really COVID that did it. But how did you actually get expelled? What was the process? How did you experience it?
Well, the context was that in 2020, during the election campaign, the Trump administration made these 4 big policy decisions that were kind of 2019, 2020, that were, I think, were part of Trump's reelection bid, which was to really bash China. And so they closed the consulate in Houston. They killed the Fulbright program. They killed the Peace Corps program, and they kicked out 58 Chinese journalists. And China responded in many of these things by closing the Sichuan consulate, the Chengdu consulate, and by kicking out roughly 15 U.S. journalists. So with anybody who was an American citizen who was accredited for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and one other publication, I think there are 4. I got in a period of bipartisanship when everybody was working to help get more journalists into China. And then I left because of a policy that was essentially aimed at cutting off ties with China. And that was so that was maybe a symbolic ending for that.
I think it's a great shame that Beijing lost you, that you're not in Beijing anymore. Many still remember fondly of your speech, your debate at the closing of Bookworm. Yeah, where you dressed up in an emperor's gown and debated whether Ming was better or Qing was better.
And I lost. I can't have done very well. Yeah, I took the Ming Dynasty, and Jeremiah Jenny, who was a very well-spoken guy, he has a PhD in Qing history. He argued that Qing was better, and he won.
Is that the motivation for you doing a PhD now?
Yes, to get back at Jeremiah.
So Sparks is about underground historians whose work stands in opposition to the Communist Party, which spins history to show that it deserved to rule. And what do you think the consequences are of the party distorting history?
Well, the consequences are that, I guess there's so many ways of looking at it. I could think of maybe just a couple off the top of my head. One would be that the party is caught in this never-ending struggle to have to justify itself by performance. It always has to be doing a great job. So if they have 9% economic growth or something like that, that's really strong and everyone's kind of getting better, all boats are rising to some degree, maybe some pockets of poverty, but overall pretty good, then you have nobody really cares about what your historical claims are. Essentially, that's your justification. Your justification is clear. Anybody can understand it. The economy is doing great, everything's going well, etc., etc. But if that fails and people begin to face problems, then I think this matters more, because people then say, "Wait a minute, they're not doing such a great job, and they don't have an explanation for why they're running the country. Why are they running the country if they're not doing a good job?"
I gather it is quite important, for the states to keep a version of history, but also for the people to keep their version of history. No one should monopolize this thing. That's the momentum behind Sparks and the individual underground historians who are working so hard to preserve a piece of history, a diverse understanding of history today. Was that the motivation for founding the China Unofficial Archive, the 中国民间档案, for you to preserve that different, diverse understanding of history?
Yeah, I thought that there was just a lack. There was no place to go where you could find all this material, and I thought it'd be a big help for people to be able to find it in one location. So I thought, hey, why not try to set this up? Shouldn't be too hard. I ended up underestimating how hard it would be because so much of it. When you begin to look at it, it's like just an amazing amount of output over the past 75 years that people have done. And that's the impressive thing. And as I began to work on it, I began even more fervently believe that it was necessary, because I thought, gosh, I don't think Westerners understand.
So what's your next plan?
I'll go to China I go to Berlin, and I'll be writing a book which will be an outgrowth of my PhD thesis, which is on these pilgrimage associations. So the narrow PhD topic is pilgrimage associations in Beijing, which is one of the groups I wrote about in local China, but I'll look at it more systematically. The more general interest book that can grow out of that is how religion and faith are being instrumentalized, being used by the CCP in Xi's China. So these groups are all being co-opted by the government and part of a government program to build legitimacy by embracing traditional values. Well, I want to keep the archive going and expand it. I hope to do more fundraising. I'd like to write a more regular column based on the material in the archive, and possibly at some point going back to China, but I'm not entirely sure. I doubt I'll be able to go back to China after Sparks, and especially after the archive. The archive got some unwanted attention because of some foolish person who had came and visited me earlier this year, and I showed her the archive website, and I showed the curator's letter. I read the curator's letter every once in a while, and the first one was, we're going to be going to the Association of Asian Studies meeting in Seattle in March. And so she took a picture of this and sent it to some well-known public intellectuals via WeChat, which is like the stupidest thing possible, and said, oh, the archive is going to have a meeting just for it with thousands of people in Seattle, and it's all going to be about the archive. It's completely wrong. The Association of Asian Studies has thousands of people going. But and we had one little panel with 4 people from the archive, which had an audience of 30 people. This is not the same as thousands of people, right? There's like literally hundreds of panels at this meeting every year. But then the PSB began calling up people, including somebody's family in China, and said that if they went to the meeting in Seattle, they're going to get in trouble. The archive was the anti-party activity, and so on and so forth. So now I think they've completely overestimated the archive. I don't think it had that kind of impact in China. I wish it did.
But looking back, how did your views on China change over the years? Can you help us trace the major changes and the sort of inflection points for you?
I went to China always as an observer, and I didn't have a sort of 5-point plan or thinking this is what's gonna happen to China. For sure, like a lot of people in the 90s, despite Tiananmen, I was more optimistic. I kind of thought that the country would become more open, but I didn't think that China would never reform. Now, I don't know if it never will. I mean, we're looking at things now, and we think things will never change, but they could change. By the time somebody looking at this 5, 10, 20 years from now, if they ever are looking at this, they may say, oh, but turns out after Xi Jinping, things changed radically in China. I don't think it's going to turn into a Westminster democracy, but who knows? The very last line of Wild Grass, I think, kept that cautious optimistic, but it was still, as I said, everybody failed in Wild Grass, right? The 3 main characters, the 3 main stories, everyone lost. But she said, I'm still waiting. China's still good. I'm still waiting.
That's all for today. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoy this one, you may consider subscribing to our Substack under the same name, Peking Hotel, with links in description. And I'll talk to you next time.